Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. And on these weekly mini episodes, we bring you bite-sized ideas for you to snack on.
Like breathing exercises, book reviews. Maybe we'll review some scientific research, or we'll share some wellness and fertility stories from our listeners.
So if you're looking for a tip or a trick related to your fertility and well-being, then you've come to the right place.
Let's dig in.
Well, we are so happy to welcome back Laura Hayden. Hopefully you listened to her full episode. We talked about a lot of stuff specific to family building. And what we hope to do in this mini episode is welcome her back to deal with one very specific and common question and issue that comes up in terms of what's involved in the legal aspects. So welcome back. And thank you so much for sharing more time with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You know, we're going to be talking about legal stuff. This is not legal advice. We are not giving you advice. Laura is not giving you legal advice. We are not attorneys. And our biggest thing is, consult an attorney for a lot of these things. But it is helpful to know the things that you might encounter when building your family when it comes to the legal aspects and how you can, one, go through the process informed and hopefully a little less bumpy. And then also how to protect your family in the future as well. So, Laura, where should we start? Because let's say we are ready to build, well, not us together having a, we're ready to build a family.
Shrug.
Okay. Where should we start when it comes to the legal? What should we think about when it comes to legal stuff with our family? Because it's something that heterosexual families don't have to deal with. We don't have to say like, oh, who's going to be on the birth certificate? Can my partner be on the birth certificate? And are they going to be a legal parent? All these things that LGBTQIA plus families have to deal with.
Absolutely. And Ruby, I love your framework of what should we think about versus maybe like what should we do? This is probably just my social work training, but my job is not to come here and tell families what they should do, what they need to do, what they have to do. The goal is to really give you enough information so that you can kind of percolate on, oh, what makes sense for my family? What options might I want to pursue and what resources are out there? And that is true of legal for sure. This is a phrase I used earlier, but that I love for this as well, is for legal, it's a little tricky because in so many ways it's asking us to think about the worst case scenario. But my goal is that you are prepared, not scared.
And I think people do need to think about that. I think it's easy to assume, oh, I've got a good relationship with so-and-so if you're involved in any kind of known situation. But you do have to think about those worst case scenarios. And honestly, I think sometimes heterosexual couples coming to the clinic should also think more about worst case scenarios. Because I think sometimes people get into legal challenges with battles over embryos for similar reasons.
I was just going to say.
People don't always consider that life does not always follow the path that we think it's going to. And so I think this episode is actually applicable to a lot of people as well.
Yeah, I think it is really important, again, like in any other decision making, to know yourself and know your family, which can take, a little bit of thought and insight and reflection here. But I think your level of risk tolerance plays a big piece on the legal side. What I see so many folks do that I absolutely understand, but I think causes a lot of stress, is start thinking about this, think this is too overwhelming. I don't know what to do. I'm going to put it off. I'm going to avoid it. And then I'm going to have a 4 a.m. panic attack later down the line, thinking about everything that could go wrong. And I absolutely understand where that comes from, right? The reality is, particularly for queer and trans families, for non-monogamous families, there have been so many threats to parentage and to civil rights. So the goal here is, what can we do so that your family feels reassured and protected so that you can, again, really access the queer joy in this process rather than worrying about what systems could do that might fail your family. So some things to think about here are, as we mentioned, if you are considering your options pre-conception, thinking about donor agreements. If you are using a sperm bank, they have their own agreement that you agree to, and you check many boxes and, read, and probably don't read very closely, but should.
It's like the Apple iPhone agreements. It's
exactly.
like, oh, there's an update. Click, click, click. I'm sure that's fine.
You read that agreement, and that kind of takes care of a lot of the legal obligations. If you are using a known donor, this is something where you may want to consult with an attorney about a known donor agreement. Again, the experience with this really varies. In many states, you will hear attorneys say known donor agreements are not legally enforceable. That does not mean that they are not necessary and helpful. What it means is that they alone don't protect your family. They're one piece of the legal puzzle that kind of shows intent about donation, right? So it helps kind of codify all the things that hopefully you and your family and your known donor have talked about of, yes, these are the intended parents of this child. No, our donor is not intended in this situation to have parental rights. And we intend to, file a confirmatory adoption, termination of rights, et cetera, that will finalize this. But it shows your intent from the beginning so that if anything funky were to come up at any point, it helps support that. That is something that some people choose to have an attorney draft for them. There are definitely some templates out there online or, through kind of some of those legal websites that you can pay for templates that work as well. It's really about your family's financial resources, risk level, access to providers. But known donor agreements can be something important to think about. If you are a family that involves two married people, there are certain protections that are more readily available to you just because a lot of our laws are kind of assume that families involve two married people, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, in many states, if you're married, it means that both parents can be on the birth certificate, even if one parent is non-biological and you have used a donor. If you are not married, that may not be true, right? You may not automatically be able to be on the birth certificate, or there are other things around like parental leave and other things for non-married folks that you may need more paperwork around. So I really suggest consulting with someone not in week 39 of your pregnancy. Yes. Earlier in the process can be really great.
And someone specific in your state, because that's one of the challenges is there is such a patchwork of regulation. Mm-hmm. And it's not even just about the intention of the people in the situation. The state has its own vested interest as well. And I know there are situations where the state has then sued a known donor to pay for child support because this was done without the appropriate legal agreements. And it's not that the known donor is trying to be involved, but the state is like, hey, from my point of view, this is someone that might be on the hook for money. So it can be very complicated based on what the regulations are where you live.
Absolutely. Confirmatory adoptions are something that I personally am a huge fan of. I mentioned I do provide social work reports for confirmatory adoptions in Washington State.
And explain, what is a confirmatory adoption?
Great question. I was going to mention that is not a strictly legal term. It's kind of an umbrella term that a lot of us attorneys and social workers use to refer to adoptions where you are adopting someone who is already a part of your family, someone you live with and parent, rather than someone who is unknown to you. So adopting a child who will in the future be placed in your home. So confirmatory adoption would include second parent adoption, third parent adoption, which is possible in many states, step parent adoption, things like that. I think there is a really common misconception that the birth certificate is enough, that having your name on the birth certificate counts, which absolutely should. Do not get me wrong. But
I was just going to say,
the resounding theme.
You can't see me, but I'm just like shaking my head this whole time.
Some of the most helpful tidbits that I have heard just in this quick snippet from some of my favorite queer family law attorneys is a reminder that a birth certificate is not a documentation of parentage. It is a document of birth. So It proves that someone was born. It does not prove parentage and can be actually changed by courts in the future if they make a different determination of parentage. And that even things like there are, some states are introducing very cool things like, voluntary parentage affirmations, things like that are non-adoptions that hopefully will be easier to access, which are very cool and are not yet Supreme Court tested. So we have not gone to the Supreme Court. We have not internationally been able to test these to see if they hold up. So again, with your risk tolerance level, is that something that will keep you up at night? Do you worry about being that test family, being that test case, right? How, do you worry about things in your family? Like, do you have complex immigration issues? Do you have complex family of origin and grandparent relationships?
That's a big one.
Do you have complex medical and medical decision-making needs among your partners and your child? These are all things that the more complex things are, the more this paperwork can be very, very helpful.
And what's the overall process for a confirmatory adoption? Like how long does it take? How many kind of visits? Do you have any sort of even ballpark pricing? Is that kind of one of the main hurdles for a lot of people?
Oh gosh, it's something that varies so much state to state. There are states where you as parents can, file some notarized paperwork yourself, pay a very small fee and send it into the court and you're done, which is amazing, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. There are other states, I can tell you in Washington state, you are required to have a social work report for one of these adoptions. You can self-file if you're someone who's confident with paperwork and legal systems rather than using an attorney. That can save you some cash. And there are some resources out there to help you do that. Many people choose to work with an attorney because it feels more comfortable for them. Mm-hmm. And so there's a little legal paperwork. There is the social work side of things, which involves some disclosure of things like medical records, financial records, asking some unfortunately invasive personal questions. My goal as a social worker, and hopefully the goal of everyone doing these, is that we make this process suck less, right? We make it the most culturally competent that it can be, the least painful. But I find that people often, I would say a very ballpark in Washington state is I know many people are paying in the range of $2,000 to $5,000. Wow. And they are taking, I would say like anywhere 3-6 months or more if there are delays with your paperwork, or depending on how on the ball you and your providers are. So it's a little bit of a slog.
Wow. Which is quite a process if you're also in the middle of taking care of a child,
Well, also,
it's not like you've got a ton of time to sit around and do paperwork.
And how much money have you already put into the family building process? Because oftentimes you're having to pay for gametes or fertility care or a gestational carrier or, gamete donor, whateper.
Although if you pay for a gestational carrier, then this is like nothing
drop
on
in the
top
bucket.
of it. Yeah,
still,
you might as well.
But that's just like it's just like yet another thing that LGBTQIA plus families have to pay for to build a family, which is unfortunate.
And I really try and emphasize to folks that I work with that this is not a pass-fail process. No one is asking, are you fit to be a parent? They are saying, how can we show all of the documentation that kind of meets standard adoption criteria so that we can confirm the civil rights that you should already have. That's kind of the goal in this. I think, again, there are many other pieces that can be helpful in here, especially with different complexities that might exist for your family. So again, if you have multiple parents, if you're in a non-monogamous family, I think this can be extra helpful, right? Working with an attorney on second parent adoption, third parent adoption. Some people even in that place can do, an intent document that can be filed during pregnancy in some contexts. So lots of different things. Again, especially if you're not married or don't have some of those other legal protections that are unfortunately limited to some families, this can be a really great time to also do your estate planning paperwork. If you're doing if you're going to be doing,
as you're talking about worst case scenarios,
if you're going to be doing crummy paperwork, this is a great time to do your medical power of attorney, to do your will, so that hopefully in one fell swoop, you can feel like, okay, no matter what happens, my family is protected. And sometimes even you can find an attorney that'll give you a package deal.
Or they do it by the hour and it's just like all, combined into the same fee.
Absolutely. So again, there's so much to know on this. A really great resource for folks is the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Don't let the name fool you. They are not limited to lesbians alone. They have a lot of information about parentage, adoption, etc. for LGBTQ families. And often they can also provide referrals to queer affirming attorneys and other professionals. So that can be a great starting point if you're looking into this. As I mentioned, Facebook groups for queer parents and other places can be another great crowd source. But I think the goal is really to find providers that will work with you to make this the least bad process so that you can check this off your list and get back to what you actually want to be doing, which is parenting and enjoying your family.
And if you find a family attorney that is very knowledgeable and has helped a lot of different families, they probably do have resources for who is a good provider to see. And if a social work visit is needed, then they probably have some people in mind, is my guess.
Absolutely. And I think what I've seen kind of reported by a lot of families is for attorneys and for social workers, technically you can use anyone who's kind of familiar with adoption processes, people who do more typical adoption, so folks adopting children unknown to them to place in their family versus a confirmatory adoption specific to LGBTQ families. You may find yourself jumping some additional hoops or facing some forms or language that aren't the most sensitive just because that's kind of their main jam. So if that feels important to you, you may consider finding a provider who really the majority of their work or what they specialize in is serving LGBTQ families.
Have you found that the paperwork for like the state paperwork or the legal stuff is not great in terms of language when they're filing?
Yes, I will confidently say that. I will say as a provider for these reports, I have made as many edits to that paperwork as I have kind of been able to get away with.
Use whiteout or
So I actually said okay, look, I've just reformatted this and kind of updated some of the language to make it more accessible. And then I just started submitting it to see if they would send it back. And so far, so good. But the original forms I got all said mother and father. Mm-hmm. And that was, when I started in 2017. This is not 20 years ago. Yeah. They said mother and father, so I changed that, right? And, even the way they talk about mental health and substance use and involvement in family courts is, say, not supportive. So as much as possible, being okay, how can we change this to be as affirming as possible while still meeting legal requirements, which I think is always the balance.
Yeah, and I think that's a parallel for healthcare too, is language is very important. It only takes a minute to sit here and think through what would we say instead of mother and father or what husband and wife, it's not super difficult once you just sit down and you start to think that way. Initially, it is kind of hard to get if you're used to talking in the binary, because that's what our culture is all taught us. But once you kind of get in the sense of using different language like partner or, or parent, something like that, you find that we can change language. And I think that's the direction I hope that we're end up going, just being completely gender neutral, like gender spectrum, kind of thing.
Absolutely. Inclusive language makes things more accessible for all families.
And this paperwork in legal, we talked a lot about kind of the post-birth, but in an ideal scenario too, if you're using gametes from someone that's not a part of the relationship and you're not buying from a sperm bank where it's kind of already been done, ideally you'd want to get this stuff done before you even get pregnant, right? So that you have everything clear even before there's suddenly a pregnancy in the mix.
Absolutely. And I think especially just there are so many stressors outside our control in this process, right? Of tracking fertility signs and ovulation and medication schedules and work schedules. And God forbid you already have other small children at home, right? That you're trying to parent during this, that as much as we can kind of check the boxes legally beforehand, gives us one less thing to worry about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And trying to find time to get your sperm shipped to you or coordinate with your known donor for schedules, because they're their own person too with their own schedules. It's there's lots of things that go on when you're actually in the trying to conceive process. So if you get that done ahead of time, good to know. Another thing we talked about in the big episode more about what to expect or how to look for a clinic. One thing to keep in mind on the legal aspect of things of going into a clinic is the policy when it comes to a legal contract, because some clinics are going to require that you have a legal contract if you have a known donor, and the difference between an actual attorney contract versus you came up with this template or used this template and got it notarized. There's a difference between the two, so make sure that you're talking to your clinic about those requirements.
Absolutely. And I hope for all of this, that this becomes less relevant over time. I hope one day this will be a wonderful relic of queer history that we don't have to do anymore. And while we do,
have our children listen to this podcast and be like, are you serious?
Exactly. Pride scary stories around the fire pit. But I think until then, as much as folks can connect with resources and connect with each other, I think, again, the goal is really to check the boxes and do the things so we can experience all the queer family joy that folks deserve.
The theme of 2022, the civil rights that you should already have.
Absolutely.
We'll make sure to post the other resources that you mentioned here, because there are a lot. You're not starting from scratch. There are a lot of places that you can learn more about all these things that we've mentioned so briefly today. And we really appreciate you coming here to talk with us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.